Hello, my name is Stacy Hoflick, and today I want to do a close reading on Abraham Lincoln's address at Cooper Institute, which happened on February 27th, 1860 in New York City. I'm doing a close reading on this speech because um, many historians believe that this speech was pivotal to his becoming President of the United States. In fact, Harold Holzer's book on the Cooper Union speech actually it calls it the speech that made Abraham Lincoln president. So this speech is really important to bringing Abraham Lincoln from a Midwestern politician onto a much more national stage. And it's an interesting speech to analyze for that snapshot moment in time. So just to give a little background here, the speech is happening in 1860, which is an election year, very important for the Republican Party because it's the first time that the Republican Party, this new Republican Party, actually has some traction for a possible win in the national election. Abraham Lincoln, who had been in politics in the 1840s, late 1830s and 1840s, had not been in politics since the end of his one term as a congressman, as a U.S. congressman. It ended in 1849. He had not been in politics since then. According to his autobiographical sketch in 1859, he said that when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, that aroused him back into politics. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was essentially the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, in which popular sovereignty, this idea that territories should decide for themselves the question of slavery instead of the federal government deciding for those territories. This was an idea that was supported by Stephen Douglas and his fellow Democrats. So this new Republican Party, and Abraham Lincoln in particular, is identifying himself as opposed to popular sovereignty and opposed to the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And we know that Abraham Lincoln in 1858 faced off against Stephen Douglas in a series of 7 debates in the summer and early fall of 1858. And a lot of the conversation and the thing that aroused Abraham Lincoln was this idea of arguing against popular sovereignty and arguing against the idea that the federal government does not have any say in what happens in the territories that are created, the states that are created from those territories. So here he finds himself in 1859 actually, invited to New York City, which is a whole new national stage for him, and he's invited to give a talk. Interesting side note here is that James A. Briggs, the man that invites him to New York City to give the talk, is actually a supporter of Salmon Chase, who is also a presidential candidate. Now, the leading, Salmon Chase is the governor of Ohio at the time. The leading candidate, Republican candidate for president is William Seward. Seward is from New York, but I guess the general idea is that Seward is not going to be able to beat Stephen Douglas in a national campaign. And so Briggs invites Abraham Lincoln to New York to speak as a way of taking votes away from Seward and possibly then opening the door for Chase. I'm not sure that that's what Abraham Lincoln sees. I'm pretty sure Abraham Lincoln is understanding that this is an opportunity to present himself on this new national stage. So that's where he's standing in 1860 when he finds himself in New York City at the Cooper Union, ready to give this monumentous speech. So he begins his speech very intelligently, I think, with a quote from Stephen Douglas. So he quotes Stephen Douglas and uses Stephen Douglas's own words to begin the speech. And he says, Stephen Douglas says, is quoted as saying in the New York Times last autumn in Columbus, Ohio, having said, "Our fathers, when they framed the government under which we live, understood this question just as well and even better than we do now." In terms of what the question is, Abraham Lincoln goes on to say, "Does the proper division of local from federal authority or anything in the Constitution forbid our federal government to control as to slavery in our federal territories?" So Abraham Lincoln is using Stephen Douglas's own words. Stephen Douglas is saying our founding fathers understood this question about who gets to control slavery in the territories better than we do. And Abraham Lincoln is starting his speech agreeing with him. He's saying, I agree. that the Founding Fathers knew better than we do the answer to this question, had a better understanding about whether the federal government was allowed to control slavery in the territories or not. And then Abraham Lincoln goes on to actually look through the voting records. He establishes the Founding Fathers as the 39 fathers who ratified the Constitution, who voted for the Constitution. And he looks at their voting records, in particular on the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, on the deeds of cession for North Carolina to cede lands to become Tennessee, and for Georgia to cede lands to become Mississippi and Alabama, and in addition on New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory. And in all of those situations, he tracks down the voting record of the 39 Founding Fathers, and he finds that 23 of the 39 voted with regards to the question of allowing the expansion of slavery in the territories. And 21 of those 23 voted to deny slavery expanding into those territories. And so with that math, 21 of the 39, he says a clear majority understood this question and understood that, yes, the federal government does have the right to control the expansion of slavery into those territories. He also mentions, which is interesting, that the 16 that he doesn't have a vote count for include notorious anti-slavery people such as Benjamin Franklin and Gouverneur Morris, people who were very well known to be anti-slavery. So this is the first hour of his speech. He goes on and on in very specific detail about exactly the names of who voted for which and what they voted, as a way of rebutting the idea that Stephen Douglas is saying, that the Founding Fathers said that we should not be determining what's going on in these new territories. Abraham Lincoln is arguing the contrary and saying absolutely the votes of the Founding Fathers tell us that they understood that the federal government absolutely did have the right to control slavery from going into those new territories. So that's a really strong part of this argument, and the research and the detail of it is very persuasive. His rhetoric is also really persuasive because he is very strong in what he says. He says, I defy any man to show that any one of them ever, in his whole life, declared that, in his understanding, any proper division of local from federal authority or any part of the Constitution forbade the federal government to control as to slavery in the federal territories. I go a step further. I defy anyone to show that any living man in the whole world ever did, prior to the beginning of the present century, declare that, in his understanding, any proper division of local from federal authority or any part of the Constitution forbade the federal government to control as to slavery in the federal territories. So Abraham Lincoln is ready to throw down and say, prove it. If you're saying that our Founding Fathers understood this question better than we did, and if you're saying that our Founding Fathers understood that they had the right in each individual territory to determine for themselves, prove it. Because Abraham Lincoln stands there before you this evening and says, I can prove to you that they understood differently. I can prove to you that you are not allowed to let slavery expand into those territories, because that's what those 21 of the 39 Founding Fathers did. And again, that's not including the avowed anti-slavery people such as Gouverneur Morris or Benjamin Franklin. So that's the whole first hour of his speech. And his speech is about an hour and a half, the first part of his speech. So in the second part of the speech, Abraham Lincoln changes his tone completely and speaks directly to the Southern people. He says, "You consider yourselves a reasonable and a just people, and I consider that in the general qualities of reason and justice, you are not inferior to any other people. Still, when you speak of us Republicans, you do so only to denounce us as reptiles, or at the best, no better than outlaws." He urges, "Bring forth your charges and specifications, and then be patient long enough to hear us deny or justify." And then Abraham Lincoln goes through supposed charges against the Republicans, and he denies each one, including the charge of sectionalism, including the charge of being radical instead of conservative, and he specifically addresses the idea that the Southern people are charging the Republicans with inspiring insurrections. Now, to give you a little context here, John Brown had perpetrated his raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859, and John Brown had been executed in December of 1859 for trying to create a slave insurrection. And so Abraham Lincoln addresses this directly because the Republicans are accused by many of trying to get this to happen, of supporting John Brown, of supporting this kind of slave insurrection. So he addresses it directly, and he says, you charge that we stir up insurrections among your slaves. We deny it. And what is your proof? Harper's Ferry, John Brown. John Brown was no Republican, and you have failed to implicate a single Republican in his Harper's Ferry enterprise. If any member of our party is guilty in that matter, you know it or you do not know it. If you do know it, you are inexcusable for not designating the man and proving the fact. If you do not know it, then you are inexcusable for asserting it, and especially for persisting in the assertion after you have tried and failed to make the proof. So he's saying about John Brown, you accuse us of supporting it, you accuse us of making it happen, but where's your proof? If you have proof, then you're guilty of not bringing the proof forward. And if you don't have proof, then there's no way that you should be accusing us of having participated in this without the proof. And then he goes on to say that maybe we didn't directly support John Brown, but you accuse us of our beliefs leading to that having happened. You insist, his words, that our doctrines and declarations necessarily lead to such results. And his response to that, Abraham Lincoln's response to that accusation, Republican doctrines and declarations are accompanied with a continual protest against any interference whatever with your slaves, or with you about your slaves. And this is a really important piece. Abraham Lincoln is establishing and reestablishing the Republican platform that the Republicans do not want to touch, alter, abolish at all slavery as it exists in the southern states. Their only statement is that slavery should not be allowed to be extended into the territories, into new incoming states. But what Abraham Lincoln's charge is that the Southern people won't listen to that they are not believing that the Republicans will leave the slavery alone as it exists in the Southern states. With regards to this question on slave insurrections, Abraham Lincoln goes further. The charge of Southampton, he mentions specifically Southampton, Virginia. When he says Southampton, Virginia, he's talking about Nat Turner's uprising, which happened in 1831. So the interesting thing that he says here is that you can't hold us responsible for what happened in 1831 because the Republican Party didn't even exist in 1831. The Republican Party began in the 1850s. You can't hold Republicans responsible for something that happened in 1831. He also goes even further to say that in this day and age, he doesn't believe that a great slave uprising or insurrection could happen because there isn't good enough communication for the slaves, and that anytime 20 or more people would know about a secret plan of insurrection, that somebody would let their master know and that somebody would let the secret out. And he specifically mentions the gunpowder plot and the insurrection in Haiti as evidence for this. And he ends his conversation with the Southern people in a very inflammatory way. Abraham Lincoln says, "But you will break up the Union, rather submit to a denial of your constitutional rights." Then he specifically addresses this assumed constitutional right. He says there is no constitutional right for this. It's not listed in the Constitution anywhere at all, this provision that you have the right to decide about slavery. And he says, your purpose then, plainly stated, is that you will destroy the government unless you be allowed to construe and enforce the Constitution as you please on all points in dispute between you and us. You will rule or ruin in all events. Now, that's a pretty interesting contrast to what he said previously, where he talked about the Southern people being rational and just. He's now making them sound like they're tyrants or they're spoiled children that you will rule or ruin in all events. So the third and final part of his speech, the last little part of his speech, Abraham Lincoln again turns his conversation toward another group. He speaks directly toward his own people, directly toward his constituents, directly toward the voters, directly toward anybody who would be interested in the Republican platform. And he speaks to the Republicans and he says, first and foremost, it is exceedingly desirable that all parts of this great confederacy shall be at peace and in harmony with one another. Let us Republicans do our part to have it so. Even though much provoked, let us do nothing through passion and ill temper. Even though the Southern people will not so much as listen to us, let us calmly consider their demands and yield to them if in our deliberate view of our duty we possibly can. So he starts his conversation with the Republicans in a very tolerant sounding way where he says, let us not do anything out of passion. Let's be tolerant. Let's listen. Let's think about what we can say and try to yield to them if in any way that we can. And then he goes on to say, will they be satisfied? Will they be satisfied if we do this? Will they be satisfied if we do this? And he then says, in no way, shape, or form will they be satisfied if we do anything at all except declare slavery is not wrong. So he starts with this very tolerant tone and then flips immediately to like, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this, and says there isn't any way to satisfy. Again, just a really stark contrast to what he had said previously at the beginning of the second section of his speech, where he talks to the Southern people and says that they are just and rational people. Doesn't sound like they're just and rational people to his mind based on the way that he's speaking to them. So, in the end, he says, they will continue to accuse us of doing until we cease saying. This and only this. Cease to call slavery wrong and join them in calling it right. That's the only thing that will make the Southerners happy. They won't listen to anything that we have to say when we say that we're going to leave slavery alone in the Southern states as it exists currently, that there is nothing that the Republicans intend to do to change or alter or abolish slavery as it currently exists right now in the Southern states. That the Republican platform is just about not allowing the expansion of slavery into those territories and the new states that are created from those territories. And then his great summary of the crux here is that their thinking it right and our thinking it wrong is the precise fact upon which depends the whole controversy. Here's the nuts and bolts. They think slavery is right, and we think slavery is wrong. And the only thing that we can do to satisfy them is declare that slavery is not wrong, to declare that slavery is right. And we can't do that. We can't declare slavery is right. We think it's wrong. We think it's a moral evil. We're okay for right now with letting it alone as it is in the Southern states. We're not okay with letting it expand. And Abraham Lincoln's doing a really fantastic job of articulating exactly what the Republican platform is here. He's saying in no uncertain terms, we plan to leave slavery as it is in the Southern states, and we plan to make sure it doesn't travel on to the new territories and states made out of the new territories, that we want it to come to its natural extinction. That's not good enough for the Southern people. And so this is the crux of the argument. Their thinking it's right and our thinking it's wrong is the precise fact upon which it depends the whole controversy. And then he ends his speech by going right back to Douglas. He ends his speech by going right back to Douglas and the idea that anybody could find middle ground with slavery. It's not possible to find middle ground with slavery, he says. There is no middle ground with slavery. Either you think it's right or you think it's wrong. And he says, "Let us be diverted by none of those sophistical contrivances wherewith we are so industriously plied and belabored, contrivances such as groping for some middle ground between the right and the wrong, vain as the search for a man who should neither be a living man nor a dead man, such as a policy of don't care on a question about which all true men do care." Again, he's directly addressing Stephen Douglas and the idea that we can find this middle ground of don't care, let them deal with it on their own, let popular sovereignty, let the people who live there decide. Abraham Lincoln is establishing himself and establishing the Republican Party as saying slavery is wrong. We have it here in the current states. We have to acknowledge that we have it here in the states. We have to accept that we have it here in the states, but we do not have to allow it to proliferate. And that's what the Republicans are saying. It cannot continue on. And that's what the founding fathers said back, the 39, the 21 of the 39. Founding fathers said slavery cannot move into these new territories. So he sort of ends where he began, against Stephen Douglas, saying there's no way for middle ground, popular sovereignty is wrong. And he ends with this really powerful, all capital letters moment where he says, "Let us have faith that the right makes might. And in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." He's leaving Republicans with a charge. Let us do our duty. And he's establishing himself as the center of that charge. It's February of 1860. It's an election year. He is ready to be the candidate for the Republicans. He's ready to push the others out of the way and say, I can be that guy. I can be your candidate. So this is happening in February of 1860. Interesting side note is that he has his photograph taken with Mathew Brady hours before he gives this speech. And Mathew Brady's photograph, a woodcut of that photograph, becomes the front cover of Harper's Weekly in May of 1860 when Abraham Lincoln has presented himself as candidate for candidate for President of the United States. This speech has Abraham Lincoln on the cusp of this, and it is this speech which was so well received, applauded, thunderously applauded, so well received by New York, puts him with a whole new audience in a whole new way to be well known. He has his picture circulated so that more than just those from the Midwest or from Illinois could vote for this new upstart for President of the United States.